The Western Front of World War I was characterised by rapid movement, battlefield manoeuvrability, and vast, sweeping actions. Briefly, very briefly in fact, as come September 1914, mere months into the conflict, things had ground to a complete halt. As a result, a vast network of trenches began to be dug, which would eventually stretch all the way from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. A vast labyrinth of fortifications, nearly 500 miles in length. Neither side was particularly chuffed about this state of affairs, however, and both were understandably eager to break through, rout the enemy, and get the whole sorry affair consigned to the history books with all possible haste. This led to a vast period of innovation, as all armies desperately scrambled to get their hands on some genius breakthrough that would make it happen. And some of them were fantastic. Take the tank as an example. It was a big, portable, armoured box with guns on it. Happy days, what wasn't to love? Others, by contrast, were absolute disasters, with militarised airships being a great example. They cost a fortune and loved to fall out of the sky and blow up. Ah, the humanity and all that. But then there were the ones that were just, well, weird. The ones that represent a bit of blue sky thinking so out there in the clouds that they become monuments to fascination for us in the modern day. And if you're after an example of one of them, consider this: the paper mâché dummy head, which was created as a tool for countering and dealing with snipers. They, as fascinating as they are also what we're going to be having a look at in today's video, so let's get on having a look at them. So, let's begin with a bit of background context, just so that we have a working knowledge of the wider situation around the dummy heads. The static nature of trench warfare in World War I created an environment where sniping could thrive as both a deadly weapon and a psychological one. Trenches stretched for miles, and soldiers were often confined to narrow, exposed pathways where any deviation or raised movement could invite lethal fire within a second's warning. This omnipresent danger transformed daily life into a tense and harrowing ordeal. Routine activities such as fetching supplies, repairing barbed wire, or even observing enemy positions required exposing oneself, however briefly, to an enemy marksman. Every soldier knew that even a momentary lapse in vigilance could be fatal. Moreover, the geography of the front lines added to the peril. Trenches were often dug in open fields, providing little natural cover, while communication trenches that connected the front to the rear areas were long, narrow, and exposed. This made them prime targets for snipers, who often stationed themselves in elevated positions such as ruined buildings or trees that afforded clear views of these vital pathways, and in such conditions the sniper's rifle became a silent predator, always waiting to strike. It's also worth noting that sniping as a specialised military practice was not a new thing at all in World War I, as in both the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, as well as even earlier American Civil War of 1861 to 65, marksmen would use rifles fitted with telescopic sights to target high-value individuals such as officers and drummers, hoping to sow chaos in the enemy's ranks and send their advance into disarray. If we wish to take it back even further too, true proto-snipers could be found during the Napoleonic War, with a great example being the British Green Jackets, who, so named for the colour of their uniform, would make use of the Baker rifle, which was very much not fitted with telescopic sights, to harry advancing formations from a distance and pick off as many of their men as possible before the real fighting started between men standing orderly across from one another using smoothbore muskets. Come the start of World War I though, one nation stood above all the others as the masters of the nascent art of sniping, and that would be Germany. Whereas other nations had neglected the art or outright failed to recognise how much of a big deal it would be on the modern battlefield, Germany had really rolled with it. And as a result, they entered the war with snipers that were meticulously trained, often selected from hunters and marksmen with prior experience of precision shooting in their civilian life. But even their efforts weren't perfect from the offset, with the kit used often being brought by the soldiers themselves when they answered their call-up papers, or procured by high-ranking officers from whatever civilian equipment they were able to get their hands on. Although the Germans did attempt to alleviate this problem in 1915 with the introduction of the Scharfschützengewehr 98 or Sniper Rifle 98, a standard weapon they could mass produce, and would also allow them to standardise sniper training thanks to their snipers, all them, theoretically at least, carrying the same weapon. Despite such niggly little foibles, however, the German snipers were good from the offset, and that's the key takeaway from all that. Naturally, they were also a terrifying thing for Allied soldiers to have to contend with. The randomness of attacks instilled a pervasive sense of dread. Soldiers never knew when or where the next shot might come. The sight of a comrade suddenly collapsing, felled by an unseen enemy, created a pervasive fear that undermined confidence and morale. This psychological toll often led to hesitation and reduced effectiveness in performing even basic duties. The situation didn't stay an entirely hopeless one for long, however, because contrary to how it's often portrayed, World War I was a war where tactics and strategies evolved very, very quickly indeed, and so the Allies soon started doing something about the looming German sniper threat, or at least they tried to. First on the agenda, naturally, was getting a bit of action for themselves, so both the French and British armies soon introduced sniper schools of their own and started codifying tactics for them to teach. These schools taught soldiers the essentials of marksmanship, camouflage, and fieldcraft, transforming ordinary infantrymen into skilled snipers capable of matching their German adversaries. New specialized sniper equipment was also introduced. Rifles equipped with high-quality telescopic sights quickly became widely available to the Allied armies, which went some way to leveling the playing field, with a particularly notable example being the Enfield Rifle No. 3T Mark I, a telescopic sighted version of the pattern 1914 rifle used by the British. Additionally, trench periscopes and armoured observation posts were developed to reduce the risks associated with spotting enemy snipers. And yet, of all the strategies adopted by the Allies, particularly the British, one stands out above all the others for its sheer simplicity and effectiveness, but also its simply peculiar nature, and that of course would be the dummy head. So, now that we have our general context for the video nailed, let's bring this chapter to a close and start having a look at those dummy heads specifically. Annoyingly, for saying how famous they are, there really isn't that much information out there on the dummy heads, which perhaps is why every other video on the matter on this most illustrious platform seems to be only 3 minutes long and regurgitates basically the exact same information as the rest. We, however, strive to do better than a quick in and out copy and paste of what everyone else has already said, and so with that in mind we started trawling the primary sources to see what we could find out for ourselves. And in doing so, the matter of the dummy heads only gets more annoyingly still, because it turns out that there is basically bugger all noted about them. For example, we turned to our trusty copy of Poilu, the fantastic memory of Louis Barthès, which, if we recall correctly, is the only memoir of a French enlisted man who saw pretty much the entire duration of the conflict, reasoning that surely a man as knee-deep in it as he was would have come across them. But nope. Nothing. Similarly, we then turned to the memoir, The Last Fighting Tommy, the life of Harry Patch, the last veteran of the trenches, and again, nada, as was also the case with Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. Getting desperate, we even turned to semi-novelized memoirs, but even then, both memoirs of an infantry officer by Siegfried Sassoon and All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque had the sum total of Jack in them. Ready to scrap the topic by that point, we then shot off an anguished email to one of our old university professors, and mercifully, those young adult years spent brown-nosing our lecturers paid dividends, because through him, success, as we were steered towards sniping in France by a man with the most Downton Abbey name we've ever come across, Hesketh Pritchard, within which was plenty of information. As for the man himself, it's only right we know a bit about him if he's going to be carrying the whole video for us. So, Major Hesketh Pritchard DSOMC, to give him his full name and title, lived from 1876 to 1922 and was an explorer, adventurer, big game hunter and marksman who ended up lending his skill with the gun to the British Army during the First World War, specifically to reform sniping and counter-sniping. They proved most useful too, as the measures he introduced to counter the threat of German snipers were credited with saving over 3,500 Allied soldiers, and the ones he introduced to return the favour were credited with taking many more lives than that. He was also an absolute unit of a fella, both in stature and action, because he was noted as being one of the tallest soldiers to serve in the entire British Army during the war, and the citation for his Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, in his title, noted that he had, quote, directly and indirectly inflicted enormous casualties on the enemy. With that being said, back to the matter at hand, his book. In doing so, the first interesting things you learn are that At first, at least, the dummy heads were not actually supplied by the army at all, but rather were paid for by the soldiers out their own pocket, as well as the fact that they used a real diverse variety of different heads. Quote, "One day I obtained leave to go to Amiens, where I visited the French camouflage works and found to my delight that they had made a number of paper mâché models of the heads and shoulders of British soldiers. Of these, I was able to purchase a large quantity and had no longer any need to buy in London, where the heads were rather theatrical properties than the real thing. The uses to which the heads were put to was varied. They were, in these early days before they were too much advertised, before they afterwards became an issue in our army, most useful in getting the enemy to give a target. It was also possible, by showing very skillfully the heads of Sikhs or Gurkhas in different parts of the line, to give the German intelligence the impression that we were holding our line with Indian troops, and I have no doubt they were considerably worried to account for these movements." Later on in the book, we also start to get an insight into how the dummy heads were actually used, with a particularly notable example being using them to basically prove the efficiency, or lack thereof, of various camouflage techniques. Quoting again, "At this time, the efforts to camouflage our loopholes were extraordinarily primitive. Indeed, concealment was nearly impossible in the form of parapet then in use. Many of our units took an actual pride in having an absolutely flat and even parapet, which gave the Germans every opportunity of spotting the smallest movement. The parapets were made of sandbags beaten down with spades, and it is not too much to say that along many of them a mouse could not move without being observed by the most moderate-sighted German sniper. It was curious how some few commanding officers stuck to these flat parapets in the face of all casualties and the dictates of common sense, and even after the High Command had issued orders upon the subject. At a later date, a trial was instituted and proved that in spotting and shooting a dummy head exposed for 2 and 4 seconds over a flat parapet, the number of hits was 3 to 1, as compared with the same exposure when made over an imitation German parapet. Continue reading and you eventually come across what appears to have been the main use of the dummy heads, and yes, contrary to how it will sound from the manner in which he wrote it, this is the order he put in the book. His writing style was a touch all over the place. Anyway, with that said, quote, "At a later date, we found a means by which we were able at once to find the position of any German sniper. For this purpose, we used a dummy head made of paper mâché. The method of using was as follows. When a German sniper was giving trouble, we selected a good place opposite to him and drove 2 stakes in our own parapet until only about a foot of them remained uncovered. To these, we nailed a board on which we fashioned a groove which exactly fitted the stick or handle attachment to the dummy head. The stick was inserted in the groove and the dummy head slowly pushed up above our parapet. If the enemy sniper fired at and hit the head, the entry and exit of the bullet made 2 holes, one from the front and one from the back of the hollow dummy head. The head, immediately on the shot, was pulled down by whoever was working it in as natural a manner as possible. The stick on which it was mounted was then replaced in the groove, but exactly the height between the 2 glasses of a periscope, lower than the position in which it was when shot through. Now, all that remained to do was to place the lower glass of the periscope opposite the front hole of the head and apply the eye to the rear hole and look into the periscope, the upper glass of which was above the parapet. In this way, we found ourselves looking along the path of the bullet, only in the opposite direction to that in which it had come, and in the optical centre of the 2 holes would be seen the German sniper who had fired the shot, or the post which concealed him. Once that was found, he was soon dealt with. Now that's some good information, because frankly, using the dummy heads to so accurately track down the enemy sniper and then actually using what was left of it to aim said counterfire was nothing short of absolute genius. Sadly, having seen those extracts, we're pretty much getting to the end of what Hesketh had to say on the matter, although a few and much more slight tidbits of information do come up later in the book. For example, there is this single sentence later on that gives us an idea of just how effective the dummy heads were at locating enemy snipers. Quote, "In trials at 1st Army Sniping School, we were able by this invention to locate 67 snipers out of 71. He also gives us just an interesting little detail about the dummy heads themselves, quoting, for the final time, "Some of those who wanted to give the dummy heads a especially lifelike appearance placed a cigarette in its mouth and smoked it through a rubber tube." It's a curious sensation to have the head through which you are smoking a cigarette suddenly shot with a Mauser bullet, but it is one that several snipers have experienced. And that's everything he tells us about them. It's disappointing on a certain level, to be sure, as certainly We wouldn't mind knowing details such as when they started being used, the cost of them, how many were used, particularly notable specific incidents in which they were used, things like that. But alas, at least as things appear at present, such information simply doesn't appear to exist. At least in the sources we can actually get our hands on. We'll keep looking, however, as we'd love to do a part 2. At least we have got ourselves a decent understanding of the general facts around them though. They started as a on-the-ground innovation, as it were, came in all manner of different shapes and forms, had some really smart elements incorporated to make them look realistic, and were used in a multitude of different ways, from testing the efficiency of different camouflage methods to accurately pinpointing the location of enemy snipers. And that will certainly do for us, given that we nearly pulled the plug on this topic due to a lack of information. Since we still have a bit of give on the old word count, thanks to the scant amount of information out there on today's topic, let's put those extra words to productive use by taking the opportunity to briefly touch on some of the dummy heads' adjacent innovations, and the other weird and ingenious methods that were used by various armies to keep their snipers alive during World War I. The most notable of all of these would be the camouflage tree, which is exactly what it sounds like. They were carefully crafted individually to mimic specific shell-splintered trees that already existed out in no man's land before they were then slowly and very quietly swapped out overnight. These trees functioned as concealed observation posts and snipers' nests hiding in plain sight. From what we know of them, because much like dummy heads, the matter of camouflage trees is annoyingly an elusive one despite how well known they are today, we know that multiple sides use them, with both German and British examples both being documented at the time and surviving to the current day, and that at their very fanciest, they could even contain internal armor plating to protect the occupant, as well as all manner of telescopes, periscopes, and photography equipment to help when used as observation posts. We also know that the British, specifically, used 45 of them throughout the conflict, with their first one being installed somewhere near Ypres at an unknown time. And that, pretty much, is all we know about them, at least from the available secondary sources. Perhaps another deep dive through the primary sources is needed in another video. Fake horse carcasses were also seemingly used in much the same way, although we really stress the word seemingly, as there's even less information out there on these. The only evidence for their use, at least that is reasonably accessible, is this period drawing, as well as these two photographs. So, what information can we glean from these three pictures? Well, they would appear to be a French thing, as this picture clearly depicts a French soldier, the giveaway being the Adrian helmet, and because said helmet was introduced in 1915, it stands to reason that they were also a thing after then. There is also a hell of a clue in this picture, because clear as day, the soldier pictured is wearing a gaiter of some kind that uses a strap that runs under his foot, and they were very rare indeed during World War I, allowing us to narrow down the possibilities significantly to a single realistic possibility, which is an American, as theirs is the only army we are aware of that wore such things with any degree of regularity, and even they eventually phased them out in favour of putties. Take all of this with a pinch of salt, however, as that photo really doesn't give us much to identify, and there's always weird quirks and exceptions when it comes to uniform, which mean that it really could be anyone. Also, neither of these photographs show them at the front, so regardless of who it was who used them, there is the possibility that these were just ideas that were prototyped and never actually rolled out. So that's the end of the story then, right? Dummy heads were a unique, if peculiar, innovation of World War I, one that was facilitated by the specific conditions of the conflict's trench warfare. And then, with trench warfare no longer being a thing, their use ceased, leaving them as naught but an interesting footnote in the First World War's history. And that's all there is to it, right? Well, actually, no, that isn't how the story ends at all. While war certainly became more mobile and fluid as a rule after World War I, there is not an absolute rule, and trench warfare specifically, and wars of attrition more broadly, have returned with a vengeance plenty of times since the armistice of 1918. And when that happens, it seems dummy heads make a reappearance along with it. Take the still ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war as an example. For all of the fancy whiz-bang kit that both sides use, the initial rapid pace of the conflict has long since ended, and it's now a good old-fashioned war of attrition. One where gains and losses are measured in meters, or if they're really lucky, maybe a few kilometers. And sure enough, dummy heads are being used, as you can see here and here. And then there's the Iraq War, an absolute slog, if ever there was one, and here's an American soldier using a dummy head. Pop over the border to Syria next, specifically back during the anti-ISIS campaign, and yep, here's some Russian troops at it too. What is it that Ron Perlman famously says about war and how it never changes? Yeah, That.